which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, and the Tsuut'ina and Stoney Nakoda nations, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta. Before we introduce the panelists, we do ask that everyone turn off their video and mute their mics. You can change between gallery and speaker view by clicking on the button in the top right-hand corner. We suggest that you hide non-video participants by right-clicking on any attendees with no video on and clicking Hide Non-Video Participants. The chat will be available to you to comment or ask any questions. If you have any technical issues, please message me, Cindy Nashrin, on the chat, and I will do my best to help you out.
So each month, AEDE's theme shifts to address a broad range of topics on equity in the built environment and in design education. In Whose City, we examine the role of power, place, and agency in the imagining and shaping of urban conditions, questioning who has the right to build and occupy space. Our panel today brings together 3 speakers from Calgary, London, Ontario, and Hong Kong to discuss their respective projects and research on the current housing crisis, planning issues, and community empowerment. Following short presentations from Hayden Patullo, Rey Young, and McLaughlin, we'll launch into a discussion about the right to the city, reflecting on contemporary challenges, as well as methods, means, and mediums for moving toward more equitable cities for all. So the question of whose city is more relevant than ever. In the wake of the worldwide protests last June calling for justice for Black lives, and the question of how citizens and protesters occupy urban streets, to the urgent situation in Halifax with Indigenous Mi'kmaq livelihoods being attacked by commercial fishermen, and the evolving structure of labor, capital, and employment as COVID-19 continues on. What's apparent is that our systems are more accommodating and privileging to some ways of life than others. The right to the city is a concept first introduced by the seminal French Marxist theorist Henri Lefebvre, and later heavily theorized by geographer David Harvey. Contemporarily, the phrase has been adapted by thinkers, activists, and revolutionaries to reclaim the city as a co-created space and to advocate for dignified access to urban life. The right to the city is not merely a right of access to what already exists, but a right to change it after our heart's desire. We need to be sure we can live with our own creations, a problem for every planner, architect, and utopian thinker. And then he says, we've been made and remade without knowing exactly why, how, wherefore, and to what end. How then can we better exercise this right to the city? So with these ideas in mind, I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker. So first we have Hayden Patullo. As a designer at Studio North with a specialization in digital design, Hayden approaches the architectural field with a passion for finding new relationships between contemporary and traditional methods. Hayden's design process leans heavily on an experimentation-based, learn-by-doing approach in order to discover novel ways of approaching problems. His experience in research and digital design as a former architecture student at SAPL and an assistant at the Laboratory for Integrative Design has led him to develop a passion for addressing current world crises with the use of contemporary design and fabrication tools. In 2019, Hayden co-authored Designing Out Waste with colleagues Joshua Tarrant and Kristen Ford, as well as GXN founder Casper Goldiger Jensen, which attempts to address construction waste and building life cycle issues using Calgary's office vacancy as a case study and robotic fabrication as a technique. In his ongoing work at Studio North, Hayden is attempting to apply these passions and methodologies toward questions of urban density and home life cycles. Right, so Hayden, you can start sharing your screen.
Cool. Everybody good on that? We're all here, sweet. Okay, so my name is Hayden. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. So today I'm going to open up this panel with the presentation on urban living and laneway housing as it pertains to sort of urban equity and new models of density in Calgary and beyond. So in my time at Studio North, one thing that they have become really well known for, I've been here only over the last year, prior to that, and with many ongoing projects, we've really had a specialization into laneway housing as a design method to address urban density in Calgary in a sort of sustainable and also equitable way in numerous kind of aspects. So today I'm going to go through 3 case studies looking sort of at how that works in some of our previous projects and where we'd like to take it in the future. So just for some quick background, I wanted to talk first about what a laneway house is, which is essentially repurposing previously unused space at the back of existing generally single-family homes as what would traditionally be known as a kind of garage space, and taking that and turning that into a living accommodation, whether that's rental accommodation or for extended family, friends, for the tenants themselves, etc. So it allows people to add a little bit more flexibility to their property and sort of adjust their style of living, as well as the urban relationship between their house, their yard, and the public realm. So this is from one of my boss, Matt Kennedy's theses that was on laneway housing. And where this idea really started for him and for my other boss, Mark, as well, was during Matt's studies in Japan, in which he noticed a sort of interesting take on density there, in which the kind of tighter restriction between public, or the tighter spatial requirements between public and private realm, and the much higher density led to a kind of interesting intermediary contested space where people would often use kind of plants or seating areas, many things like that, to create a little bit more connection between public and private space and a little bit more of an intermediary boundary between these, and how people would claim that space was architecturally was really interesting to him. And then as well, how the family models and the business models of this worked in very close proximity with each other. And funny enough, he doesn't know this yet, but I actually, during my time in Japan and study abroad, I had very similar conclusions as well from my observations of those neighborhoods and people's kind of reclamation of private public space and the intermediary space between, architecturally, programmatically, etc. And then anchoring Matt's observations in Japan as well is Mark Erickson, who spent lots of time teaching architecture in the Gambia, located in West Africa, and really made note and was struck by these interesting familial compound typologies of architecture, in which each family kind of has a large allotted space in which they can grow, they can adjust to the growing extended family because they have sort of extended relatives and children and grandparents, parents living there all in the same area. And he was really fascinated with these relationships and how these compounds work and grew over time, and the sort of social connections over the short and long term that they were able to create. And this resulted in Matt's eventual thesis on laneway housing, which was looking at how we can sustainably increase urban density in places like Calgary that are so dependent culturally on single-family homes up to this point, while retaining the character of many of those homes, but also increasing the density to allow for more affordable housing, allow for more versatility, and allow for more community, very sort of strictly divided along public-private property lines. It's just some sort of bylaw blueprints around how to build a laneway house and what's involved in that. So the first case study and one of the early projects that they embarked on in this was the Bowling Laneway, which is located up by Crescent Heights. And this project really takes an interesting approach at, I think, defining new relationships first and foremost between the street and the public realm, as well as between it and the original house. And the big motif kind of that's going to carry throughout all of this that you'll see in this photo really strongly is the idea of increasing density in a sustainable way that gives a little bit more power to homeowners to expand out without kind of this developer-centric duplex and fourplex housing expansions that have become so prevalent in high value land throughout Calgary. And since this house was built, actually the houses on both sides that used to be single family homes have been developed and turned into duplexes. So this is really sort of a symptomatic look at kind of what the typical model for density in these neighborhoods becomes as the city expands versus what it could be kind of with this new model of laneway housing. And as I mentioned, the most interesting part of this project is kind of new relationships with the public. There was lots of discussion in the approval process of this project in the overlook over the lawn bowling area, which is right next to it, and ended up being a very positive actually thing that this project was considered for, was kind of the ability for lawn bowlers to actually talk and have sort of talk with and have an audience from the upstairs balcony at the back. And then also sort of using material along the facade to kind of informally delineate parts of the backyard that could be more for laneway house users at the back around here, and also the original home backyard and back deck here, which creates a new interesting relationship that's not just private property, public property, but kind of has a potential gradient in there based on who's occupying this. You can kind of get that idea in this picture of being able to informally divide this without hard boundaries. It's just some interior shots of that and how that kind of panned out in a really interesting way. But I think the best kind of part of it is the overlook and the negotiation with the community lawn bowling arena right next door that you can look out over from this balcony, and the new relationships that creates. So a second big question that came up, particularly in the City Council's discussion of approving these projects, is preserving heritage and preserving character of existing neighborhoods. So this is Parkdale in the 1920s, in which our next project's located, and actually the first laneway that Studio North did in Calgary. And this is what Parkdale looked like then from an aerial view. I'm not sure how they took this, maybe with a hot air balloon, but that's where this property is located. And fun fact, Matt Kennedy's current house is this house right here. So that's pretty interesting and exciting. But the Withrow is a sanctuary heritage house located in Parkdale that's historically recognized by Calgary as one of our heritage assets. So one of Studio North's very first projects was a restoration of this house into usable kind of valuable property for people in the inner city, rather than demolishing it and replacing it. It's just an idea of what it looked like before and what it looked like after with the floor plans. And then some nice interior shots of how that renovation panned out, with maintaining some of the original character elements of the fireplaces and the stairs, but also incorporating kind of contemporary modern amenities. And then another interesting theme that carries through this from the last bowling laneway is repurposing and reprogramming the backyard to be almost a shared intermediary space between these, and the front yard, as you can see, as being really kind of ownership by the owners of the original house. And so reimagining that as an urban configuration for family housing that turns from single to multi-family. You can see the laneway behind it, which was a really exciting project for Studio North, and continues to be, because it was really a model for laneway housing in Calgary and kind of a prototype of that allowed for them to kind of rent this out to be used for family members when they were visiting. It's gone through, Matt Kennedy used to live here in the house and have people visit here all the time. We have a little shop and garage in here. We store materials and sort of cut things on a CNC sometimes. So some views towards the lane, and it's out of the photo now, but all of the houses in back have also turned into kind of duplex, large, very high density housing as well, which is, yeah, kind of funny that this is a pretty consistent theme throughout. It's just some good views of the interior and how that looks and how that interfaces with the street and with the back lane in terms of the views and the program of this space. And then lastly, one big theme that comes up is aging in place and new familial relationship possibilities with having these laneway houses be part of an existing single family property. So a big question and a big sort of urban problem that we believe in is the integration of kind of all audiences within a social community in Calgary, in inner city and in suburban neighborhoods. So being able to sort of create this model that has the potential to be more inclusive for elderly residents who are typically kind of relegated to seniors communities that tend to be quite a bit further out and allow for a lot less mobility, a lot less kind of family visits, and create lots more sort of social problems, as well as sort of health problems that have been shown to be caused by isolation from their communities and from their family. And so I'm just going to scroll through this really quickly, but having this model for aging in place rather than the traditional senior home model and the lower density model better allows for them to be closer to their families in a place where they can live kind of right in the backyard and have still retain a level of independence from their family, but also have kind of the semi-living caretaker element that they require in order to live out the rest of their lives, as well as being close to their family, as well as with the sort of symbiotic relationship of, we always talk about them being potentially helping out with childcare for growing young families in the city. And there was a project we did last summer in Edmonton for a contest for multifamily housing, and that was a big part of that model, was incorporating seniors living and incorporating kind of a much broader variety of demographics than would usually be able to exist within an inner city community. And that's laneway housing for you guys and how it relates to urban equity. Thank you very much.
Awesome, thank you so much for that presentation, Hayden. So next up, we will have Rey Young. So Rey is a Ph.D. candidate in geography from the University of Calgary. He received his Master's of Philosophy in Sociology, as well as a Bachelor of Science in Sociology from the Hong Kong Baptist University in 2006. During his postgraduate studies, he worked in different institutes in Hong Kong as a researcher and a project officer, engaging in housing policy and community study. In Calgary, he teaches courses on urbanization and urban planning, urban social geography, urban politics and governance, and globalization. Rey's recent work focuses on gentrification, comparative urbanism, neighborhood change and inequality, and urban governance and governmentality. Great. You can share your screen when you're ready, Rey.
Sure. Could you guys see that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everybody. This is Rey. Thank you for your invite. And today I would like to share about social differentiation in Hong Kong's urban renewal. This speech would be divided into a few parts. First of all, I would briefly introduce the background of Hong Kong. Then I will talk about the model of urban renewal in the city, also the social differentiation in the policies. After that, I will discuss the public interest discourse and community value. Finally, we would conclude the speech. As you may know, Hong Kong is located in the south of China. It's a really dense city with 7.4 million population. Its density, the urban area is one of the highest in the world, and that is five-fold of Calgary, about 6,500 per kilometer. In this city, urban renewal is an important means to economic development. As the land is scarce, especially in the urban area, the government use the methods to generate land for development, and the government's finances highly relied on the revenue from the land development. Its model of urban renewal is a public-private partnership model, which means the government would collaborate with the developers to do the urban renewal. And the status organization for the for urban renewal is Urban Renewal Authority, which we call it URA. It's kind of a implementer. It initiates urban renewal projects, including planning, implementing, advocating for land resumption, also building or selling of the land kit for urban renewal. Other than that, it also plays a more passive role to respond to requests from the owners who want to initiate urban renewal projects. Okay, the private developers play a role like collaborators of the government. It would purchase properties from individual owners and initiate projects according to their need. And other than the initiator role, they would also collaborate with the URA, as I say, and financialize the project. They would be responsible for design, build, and sell the properties in the site. In the contrast of the more active players in the process, the residents of the original areas is more passive. Like the owners, they would of course compensate for with 2 times the current market value of the original units, which most of these buildings are over 30 years and in poor maintenance. In theory, according to the policy, those owners could buy a easement unit, which is about 7 years in the same area or adjacent areas. However, in the reality, because of the urban renewal rate or property price, because of the improved environment and more investment in the areas, the property price would raise up and they could hardly afford to buy a replacement home in the renewed area or the adjacent area. They have to move to cheaper and poorer neighborhoods in the city. Tenants are more powerless in the process. They have no say in the urban renewal most of the time. They will be removed to public rental housing or provide with cash allowance. Honestly, the URA would conduct some public participation events, and they include advisory committees, district councils, or public meetings, surveys, or roadshows. But all these are minimal to the original plan. In my study, I found some cases with 99% opposition to the projects, but only 1% support. It still has no impact on the original plan, and we find no important amendment or a cancellation to any projects. From this model, we can see the extremely imbalanced power of different stakeholders in the process in the urban renewal. The government, I mean, the URA play an important and powerful role in the process as initiator, planner, and implementer. the government is not only a regulator, but also the player, was the one who initiated the whole project. However, as you know, Hong Kong's government is not democratic, and URA is not a democratic organization. The accountability is questionable. That's why it's always criticized with collusion between the officials and developers. As you know, there's a big money in the urban renewal, and a lot of people will be affected. Developers is an important player in the process, and what he want or what they want is profit, right? Making money in the process, and they would try to increase the efficiency and try to steer their project in a market-oriented way. And sometimes they would become the owners in their projects. In contrast, affect owners would be more like respondents and dispayees in the project. Their property rights was infringed. In most of the time, they would displace it with compensation to poor and cheaper neighborhoods. Their original life and social network would be destroyed. Affected tenant is less powerful and has no say in most of the time. In my study, many of them feel disappointed and has no incentive or hope to stay. What they want is just, oh, okay, just try to get rid of this difficult situation, move to somewhere else, like public rental housing. Sometimes they would be evicted by their landlord before the property is acquired. Their original life and social network, of course, would be destroyed. And okay, who would enjoy the fruit of urban renewal other than the developers who gain money from the process? It is the newcomers who could afford the increased property price, and they would enjoy the improved living environment, not the original residents or the working class people who need improved living condition. Then we would raise the question, urban design and planning for whom and why? Are they for the working class people or the original people who are living in subdivided apartments, or the long-term tenant owners who already stayed in the community for long, or who could afford those expensive properties built after the renewal? The URA gave the answer as, claim the renewal projects are based on public interest, but they have provide low clear definition. In the model, we found the government is more consider urban renewal in an economic way and try to modify the urban renewal as an economic booster. In the same way, the developers did a renewal project into market-oriented way and disregard the community value and the original residents. In some cases, we found the new building prices sevenfold of the original one, and most of these projects would only build high-end residential and commercial buildings instead of affordable housing. even in some cases with postponed. The reason is not by social discontent or opposition, but the setback of the property market. What they see or seek is the higher potential value of land rather than the need of the original area or the public. There's no affordable housing or public rental housing built in any renewal project in Hong Kong. As a result, the original social network or life of the original residents would be destroyed. They will be displaced to somewhere in poor living condition that they can afford. The original area would be gentrified. I mean, the property would be more expensive, lived by middle-class people, and also the commercial areas like stores would be upgraded and only patronized by the middle-class people. Things are more expensive, of course. Yeah, okay. In this speech, we can understand government in Hong Kong see urban renewal as an economic project and consider in economic domain. The power or the power of different stakeholders in the process is extremely imbalanced. While the government is dominates the process and chef the developers need try to be more profitable, and the tenants and owners could only respond to what they do and has no incentives to fight or to stay. As a result, the economic development or the improvement of the city would be at the expense of community benefits and the working class people. We can see a beautiful city through this picture, but we can't really forget what it is sacrificing. Yeah, the original life and network of the working class people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rey.
No problem.
All right, so next up we have Tara McLaughlin. So Tara is a licensed architect, designer, and heritage consultant practicing architecture at a small firm in London, Ontario called A-Link Architecture. She holds an honors Bachelor of History degree from Western University in London, a Bachelor of Environmental Design Studies from Dalhousie, and a Master of Architecture degree also from Dalhousie. Tara completed an exchange at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow and based her thesis on a trip to Porto in Portugal, where she spent time studying the architecture of the city and working with students at the Porto School of Architecture. Tara has also worked abroad, partnering with the University of Banjul in Gambia, West Africa, and has worked in firms in Toronto, Brantford, and in Ottawa. All right. Tara, you can go right ahead.
Thank you so much. Okay, can everyone see that? Okay, so thank you so much for welcoming me to this presentation today and this panel. I prepared something that's divided into two parts. So the first part will be discussing the thesis work I was involved in while I was in school, and the second will focus more on some professional work. So whose city For my thesis, the title of my thesis was From Industry to Culture, Renewing Disadvantaged Communities Through Local Art and Craft in Portugal. Some of the key words tying back to the idea of reclaiming the city are place versus placelessness, gentrification, art, architecture and craft, adaptive reuse, small-scale design intervention, renewing disadvantaged communities, and co-create space. Two key quotes that really generated my thesis, and particularly my approach to regenerating the site, were to live in an environment which is to be endured or ignored, rather than to be enjoyed, is to be diminished as a human being. And that's Edward Ralph. The second quote is, whether you feel you believe you belong depends in part on the messages you receive from your immediate environment. Human beings are intrinsically programmed for clear evolutionary reasons to tell whether they fit in and are in an environment that will help them survive or not. And that's Jeff Mulgan. So these are two authors focused a lot of their work on placemaking and living community and development. So my thesis takes place essentially in Porto, Portugal. The key river that runs through the artery of Portugal and into Spain is the River Douro, and that is the heart of Porto. Porto, the city, is located to the north of the river and faces south. There are two main areas that were critical in my thesis. So the district of Ribera, which is considered the old center and is a World Heritage Site, and the district of Alexo, which is the abandoned site and the location of my thesis project. Here you have an image of the Ribera district. Clearly you can see the Portuguese influence in architecture, the genus loci created by the proportion of buildings, the feeling of space, density, the relationship of the streets and the buildings to the waterfront, and the importance of the river. By contrast, here's an image of the site that I ended up choosing for my thesis project. You can clearly see the difference between the Ribera and this site here. Unfortunately, I couldn't get extremely high quality photos because I decided to work on this project in more detail once I had returned, but I did what I could, and that was part of the research project itself. So these are the towers that were built essentially in the 1970s to relocate and help some of the people that were living in this area who had been relocated due to gentrification. They moved into these towers essentially. And these were all the remaining buildings of a former industrial site. So this was the site that I explored. While I was in my time in Porto, I spent a lot of time walking along the river spine, experiencing the waterfront and understanding the relationship between the old Porto and the newer, more industrialized and abandoned site. So the distance between the old town and the new town was approximately 35 minutes to walk or 15 minutes by a streetcar. I also looked at the ancient city and the development of the historical old town through to closer towards the ocean along the river spine, and you can see the site that I chose is located here in red. Another aspect of my exploration involved the development along the waterfront. So as you can see in the more historical areas, the development was quite dense and quite steep towards the waterfront, and as you moved out towards the ocean, towards the west, you notice that the way that the development is constructed is it becomes a lot more gradual and less dense. A lot of the inspiration I also found in photography while walking along the waterfront was in the old town. There was a lot of influence of the river culture with boats and transportation by the river. There was a lot of construction as well, as boat building was a major role in Portuguese culture. Things like glasswork and intricate design and detailing of buildings, and then typical balconies with fabrics hanging and textiles. There's also a lot of ceramic work, pottery, and other crafts. The interesting thing about Portugal is that the art and architecture are very much one and the same. So there's not a lot of high art and sculptural and painting work, but you'll see actually a lot more of that within the architecture itself. Walking along the riverfront, I also investigated and discovered a lot of the cultural and community centers that were playing a role in the culture of the city. I noticed that as you neared towards the site that I chose, they were few and far between. Another big aspect that tied my site back to the Heritage District was the discovery of several sites that were also derelict between the site that I'd chosen in the district of Alexo and the Riviera town. These offered possible potential infill and potential for development or new projects that could be tied to the site that I was looking at. So here are a few images of the site in the plan and in a panorama view, just to give you a concept of what it was like when I arrived. So you can see from the panorama, the site was completely blocked off by a concrete wall that had been tagged with a significant amount of graffiti. To keep in mind, the riverfront is actually on the other side of this road. So it's completely separated from the river. You can really get a sense of the housing complexes beyond. And then this site here was completely abandoned. There was several concrete buildings that had fallen into decay. There was also a brick and iron truss warehouse that had the roof completely removed, and then there were some stone walls that were sort of remaining but in decay as well. So essentially the site had fallen to ruin. This is giving you a sense of the materiality that was on the site when I was doing my investigation. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get into the site to do a lot of work, but I was able to make some observations. So looking at the site itself, I did a lot of research and analysis on the evolution of the site over time. And the site was essentially an area for industrial development, as well as boat building, and bathing along the riverfront was also a big part of the site. So in order to identify a way to approach something like this and to consider a way to improve the site, which would also help to improve the community beyond, I looked at the way that the industrial factories would have operated on the site and considered that as an approach to operating a program on the site in the same way. So the ideas of manufacturing and shipping and storing were translated into areas for making, showing, and selling. So this essentially looked at a comparison between the program of the site for industry and then looking at the potential for its use as a cultural center, a place where the community living beyond in the housing complex could come and feel reconnected with the site and with the waterfront. I looked at several different master plan and urban context relationships and developed a zoned diagram that helped to identify places that I could intervene onto the site. Through the program of learning, I developed an approach that would help to generate economic stability for the site, for the people who would be using it, primarily living in the community of the housing complex to the north, as well as for visitors. So there were several outcomes, including development of skills, as well as the ability to sell their products and engage with tourists, as well as the local community. User profiles examined people living in the community that would benefit the most from introducing the idea of a community learning center focused around art, architecture, and craft. Young males would benefit from several aspects, as would youth, the elderly, and children. In this way, a holistic approach to the community living center would allow for various user groups to enjoy different aspects of the of the center, and to be engaged in different programs. For example, youth could be working in wood shops and learning skills that would help them and realign them with the boat building history of their culture. Older males in particular, working with glass could help reconnect with the stained glass culture, as it is a very difficult and very skilled craft to learn. Elderly would be very comfortable working in textiles and weaving, as it is not too difficult on your hands if you are dealing with stress and age, and could allow for tensile and return to the ideas of weaving and connecting. Children can easily work with pottery, which would allow them to gain enjoyment and skills working with clay and helping to create other tiles and things like that. So the idea of working with materials and thinking about how people would actually be able to programmatically use spaces within the site help to inform the approach to the site. So thinking about adding, covering, weaving, and extending, thinking about how you would use art and craft as the approach was really the inspiration to intervening on the site itself. So the idea of adding, using wood as a material, and reflecting on the boat building culture helped to identify workshops. covering and looking at glass as something flexible and light could allow for rehabilitation of the exhibition area in the long building with the iron trusses. Weaving with textiles could allow for anchoring to the stone to create a dynamic juxtaposition between the two, and extending out the extending out the ground condition could help create a green roof and also extend the distance between the houses and the site. So ultimately, a master plan was developed for the site that offered a reconnection with the waterfront beyond and to the housing complex in the north, opening up the site and regaining connection to the city. So workshops were organized into the back of the site with a focus on the community, a learning center area in the form of a vocational training center. A market area was located further south to the site that would provide interaction between community users as well as visitors and guests to sell products. An exhibition space would allow for areas to exhibit work and also to hold community meetings. Here are some sections that help to identify the approach to the project. We see the towers in the back with the workshops here, and you notice the references to the boat building. In this long section here, we see the studio workshops as well as the market with the reference to the tactile structures. Here's the actual lower plan where you can see the lower level of the workshops, the market area, and the exhibition space, as well as an amphitheater, potential for large outdoor spaces. The wall has been removed with some markings just indicating where it formerly was, and ground conditions opening up the space. The idea would be that people working in the center could essentially design and help to build it and be funded partially through the government as well as nonprofit agencies. Ultimately, the site would generate its own income and eventually be able to be built up even further. Here's a few zoomed in images. Here's a rendering showing a closer idea of the approach to the workshops with a sort of nod back to boat building. A plan of the exhibition areas with sliding glass walls. And you can note here in the rendering that you see the sliding glass walls and the idea of opening up the space. A glass roof was also investigated as part of this, and I actually constructed a one-to-one detail looking at how this could possibly work to bring light into the space. And the market area was the third area of focus and allowed for a really nice courtyard typology to develop and bring a lot of life and excitement back into the space. The renderings themselves were created to have an unfinished look and give the sense that the site was not going to be completed but would be built over time through participation by the users themselves. And the key concept and the catalyst of this project was tying back to the Riviera. Note that there were derelict sites located along the river spine. So the potential for these sites to become further smaller art projects and even infill projects for other centers and smaller opportunities used by the community and developed by the community would be able to tie the site back to the Riviera as well as improve the condition of these smaller sites beyond the larger site. So that's essentially the thesis work. So I'll move next into my professional work. So before I actually started working, I actually traveled to the Gambia myself to work for the University of Gambia Banjul with the BCBD program. So I'll just quickly show an image here. This is the class that we worked with. And I was lucky enough to work with the students and professors here to understand how they build things and to help them improve the way that they build and understanding their community as well. So I felt that that was a really nice opportunity, especially because I spent so much time in my thesis talking about community development. So I'm going to talk about 4 projects briefly that I've been involved in. These projects don't necessarily highlight gentrification or the programs that I spoke about in my thesis. However, I do feel that they really help to reconnect these spaces with the city and provide improved public areas for users and the community. The first project is Union Station in Toronto, Ontario. Union Station has undergone a revitalization project for the last several years. The main head house, which you see in this image, and then the train shed were constructed between 1914 and 1927. excuse me. However, they've undergone a large restoration and rehabilitation project that's currently underway. Multiple platforms and multiple people and conglomerates are involved in this project, including the City of Toronto and Metrolinx, as well as Via Rail, Parks Canada, the Ministry of Sport, Tours, of Heritage, Tourism, Sport and Culture, as well as the City of Toronto. So as you can see from this diagram, some aspects of the project have been completed already and some are underway. There was a large glass addition added to the train shed, and then the head house has also undergone a lot of restoration and renovation work on the interior. Ph.D. Architects was retained as part of the second phase of teams involved in the work to undergo the restoration and rehabilitation of the train shed. Our involvement in the project as Heritage Architects was to ensure that the work being implemented, any new work being implemented, was aligned with the heritage designation of the National Historic Site, and to make sure that any of the detailing that was done was compliant. Here you can see that this is the glass addition that was proposed and constructed above the Union Station train shed. This is the view looking from south, looking north from Maple Leaf Square, and the Air Canada Centre is just to the east. Here's a view of looking at the now constructed new glass atrium that rises above the existing train shed. Note here you can see that the existing train shed roof, the original roof, was partially removed and the new construction of the glass inserted. So it was really important to ensure that the respect of the relationship between new and old was maintained. The whole plan for this project essentially was to bring its users more flexibility and safety, and to open up the space, as well as within the head house to per train station and for public users. The second project that I'll talk about, the new Toronto Courthouse. This is a project by Renzo Piano Building Workshop in working with Nor Architects, and Ph.D. Architects were the heritage architect for the project. We were retained to complete an HIA as well as a cultural assessment to assess the impact of the proposed design on the cultural heritage of the area. We also worked with the urban design approach and the urban design panels to ensure that it worked from an urban design condition. So on here you can see the outline of the project. The reason that I think this project is incredibly important is because it took an old site. You can see here it was a parking lot. So it's essentially an infill project, but it's an incredibly well-designed project that considers the outdoor and heritage fabric, as well as creates a relationship between the outdoor and indoor. You can see here this rendering by Renzo Piano Building Workshop really gives a sense of the scale, but also a relationship to the outside. And this section really highlights the thoughtfulness put into creating an outdoor piazza with seats and landscape, so that it didn't just become a building for the users, it became a space for the community as well. Finally, the last project I'll speak about is the London Normal School project. This is an adaptive reuse project that was generated by the City of London for the tenant of the YMCA. So this is a former picture of the building that was built around 1898, and it was meant to serve as a teacher training facility. So you can see from the image that the building was boarded up and was not in very good condition. It is a provincial heritage property, so it was being maintained, but only barely. Here are some conceptual sketches of the project to give you a sense of the approach. Ultimately, the YMCA wanted to bring in a childcare center, provide community spaces, as well as offices for their staff. A glass atrium, an addition was added onto the rear to provide accessibility so that the building could be used by all people. Here's an image of the glass addition at the rear. So this is the south of the building. Keep in mind that this neighborhood had not undergone necessarily gentrification recently, but was actually a very nice neighborhood already. However, the building itself was an eyesore and was not contributing to the community. So the construction of this addition and the revitalization of this property vitalized and a really enjoyable part of the community, especially the outdoor areas were reconnected and parks were built. The park was highlighted as an important part, and there was a playground built. The addition of the glass atrium was a really nice connection to the existing heritage house, excuse me, to the existing heritage building. And at the rear, you can see at night, the building becomes a beacon in the community. So I think that's everything. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for your presentations. Up next, we'll have Melissa and Natalie moderating the next panel portion of this presentation today.
Again, thank you, Hayden, Rey, and Tara. Those were very thought-provoking presentations, and I'm excited to see how these themes come out in our discussion. So now we are going to be moving to the panel discussion, and once again, we will open the floor again later for additional questions. So the first question is directed at Rey and Hayden, but of course, Tara, feel free to jump in. So following up on your perspectives and on hearing about the challenges and opportunities to bring systemic change to the communities in which we work and live. So in the context of gentrification, neighborhood change, and policy political difficulties, for example, bylaws, what are the most pressing issues that must be adapted for our existing cities to consider space in a more equitable way? Whoever wants to go first can jump on.
Okay, I think I can talk about it first. I think the most important issue in the way is the way of thinking in urban development. Put it simply, sustainable urban development covers economic development, social development, and environmental protection. It's a cliche, right? These domains are not mutually exclusive and can be mutually reinforcing. However, the economic consideration usually, if not always, dominates the current process of decision and policy making. To move toward a more equitable way of considering space, we have to change the current model of urban developing and stress more on the value of social and environmental domains. I have to emphasize the interactions of these domains are dynamic and contextual basis. In Hong Kong's case, our government has more than 250 billion US dollar revenue, and economic resources not a serious problem, obviously. Urban renewal projects still in economic consideration as little nonsense, right? Of course, we are not requesting the government to spend all the money on everything, but it's not always on making money, and have to stress on more on other values instead of just profit, right? Once the mind change, diverse planning and designs which are friendly to environment and original community would become feasible. For example, a sustainable percentage of a significant percentage of affordable housing could be required in all urban renewal projects in Hong Kong if they want. Just make a law and make it a requirement. Then a lot of social tragedies could be prevented, and different classes could enjoy the improved environment. That's why I think the change of mind is the most important issue in this discussion. Yeah.
I think Rey touched on a really good point that I was going to bring up, and that Angat also asked me earlier in the chat, which is the idea that in policy discussions, we're not just by municipal bodies, you're not just kind of making decisions on behalf of people, but you're actually sort of meaningfully including those audiences and those groups with within those policy discussions. And the really strong and relevant example I would bring up, which is pertinent to laneway housing, and I would imagine to housing all over the world, is that earlier in the last decade, when the Calgary City Council was talking about blanket approval for laneway housing and secondary suites in Calgary and basement suites, the language around it and all the sort of apprehension towards it was largely predicated on not really treating renters and that significant portion of the population as kind of real citizens with real value to the city. It was really sort of predicated just on the idea that, you know, homeowners are taxpayers and that's who we care about, and that's who we're going to tailor all of our policy making on housing strategy for the next 10 years towards, rather than saying, you know, renters and people that don't have the income to buy a home are a significant contributor, not just in, you know, taxes that they obviously pay, but in the services they provide and in being able to be a meaningful part of the social fabric and provide, you know, the services that are required for a city to run. So I think there has to be sort of a recognition of, you know, all audiences that are part of a city as having, you know, proportionate contributions to the city's functionality, and in really using that to include them in discussions and policy making better, to be able to make decisions that benefit them, not just benefiting kind of the economic front runners of the city, as you will, that people see the most obvious kind of contribution from through tax dollars or donations and things like that.
Great, thank you both for your answers. This question is directed at Rey and Tara. We are especially interested in how your research work in Hong Kong and Portugal might compare to issues in Canadian cities you currently reside in. So from your presentation, this question of conflict between groups of people is especially salient in our topic, Whose City? So with that, how does cultural representation and advocacy play a part in community resilience? With socioeconomic issues such as the inflation of property value and gentrification affecting marginalized groups more, how might we mediate dominant and non-dominant cultures to strengthen community ties?
Okay, I'm going to talk about it first. You're touching a really good point here. The change of current urban development model should not only happen in policy realm or in a top-down way, but also in our culture and in a bottom-up participation. To develop a resilient community, we need the involvement of different social groups and classes. It is not only because any serious resistance from any group would destabilize our community and life, but also because we are sharing the same space and being the stakeholders together. Sense of belonging and involvement is the key for their participation. We have to conduct genuine public participation events, which are critical to the decision making, planning, and design. Of course, they would be really different from what the Hong Kong government is doing. I think Canada is a democratic country, and I believe its culture of mutual respect and openness would be the key to the successful public participation. In the process, different groups and culture can understand each more, and it doesn't mean the conflicts between them can be reconciled, but it provides a platform for compromising, understanding, and developing a common ground for further development, right? The development of participation culture not only how the community members who develop their neighborhood according to their local need, but also provide open space for different cultures. It's really important, yeah, for the whole change. Yeah, that's what I'm gonna say.
I think that you bring up a couple of really good points, Rey. I think that in my work in Portugal as well, there isn't the same sense of multiculturalism that we have in Canada. So people aren't as open or comfortable with the idea of providing, different space for different people. I think that there is a lot less separation. That the idea, and I do touch on this in my thesis, I know that with the housing complexes that were located to the north of the site, those were obviously degraded and in poor condition themselves. But a big part, I think, of helping to shorten that gap or bring together the non-dominant and dominant cultural communities is to provide that space for play, to provide that space for learning and creativity. And I think that even if you're living in a community where the housing is subpar or degraded and has been essentially neglected, if you provide outdoor spaces or areas through architecture and design that offer the idea and sense of protection and safety and respect, then that essentially is reciprocated into the community that's living nearby. So I think that that was the approach in my thesis. And I think that in Canada, there are a lot of areas where there are buildings that have fallen into disrepair or have been neglected, and particularly in communities that are, impoverished or not experiencing a lot of influx of money and tourism, the ability to look at these as just as important, if not more important than more tourist areas, to improve them and to rehabilitate them so that we can bring up the level of these communities and make them on par with everyone else so that we have an equal and balanced playing field. I think that that's a big part of it. It's not just the living area, it's the area beyond. It's the city living room. So I think that kind of tying in a little bit, I'm not sure if that makes sense, but yeah.
Awesome, thank you guys. So our next question, Hayden and Tara, how can design professionals, planners, and others involved in the discipline of buildings alike address density within modern cities that often value modern commodities, such as lawns and private green space? What does equitable housing look like in regards to shared space and private space? And how can new paradigms for ideal and dignified living be addressed through design?
I think to go back to something I referenced earlier in the chat, that really trying to break down the idea of homogeneity in communities, which is typically so sort of stratified through the socioeconomic structure of how cities work, between inner city living, suburban living. I think starting to break down that homogeneity and introduce new models of living and really new opportunities of living for different social classes is a really strong way to strengthen communities overall by introducing new kind of diverse audiences into those arenas that wouldn't necessarily have been sort of accepted or present before. I think that's really important. I think another really important aspect that I haven't talked much about yet is that particularly in Canada, where, if I remember correctly from a few years ago, racialized poverty was almost twice as high in urban centers as non-racialized poverty. I think recognizing that economic issues around housing, at least in our country, are inherently racial issues as well. And so by, finding models of us working, we're most often obviously working for people who have the money to do that, but in ways that can create new spaces for people to sort of increase their economic mobility within cities without sort of relegating them to traditional models that really constrain them to, living in a very small inner city apartment or in kind of older dysfunctional housing versus moving, out of the city and not being as big a part of that community. I think offering more options for that economic mobility is kind of really key in our practice and how, architecture and for housing in general in Canada should be moving forward, ideally.
I think just to touch on your points there, Hayden, about economic viability and economic development, that is such a critical part of feeling like you can succeed and feeling that your environment is going to support you in that opportunity and in that direction. And I think that housing plays a large part in that, as you mentioned, as well as obviously in my thesis and in a lot of the work that I did in terms of research, not only in Europe, but also in North America, community development programs that are looking at reassociating unused and infill spaces for potential community development projects that generate income and promote value creation mechanisms is a proven way to improve communities. So it's not only the architecture, but it's also the program of those value creation mechanisms that serve as a catalyst to help encourage economic development and will help sort of twofold within the community itself, but as the individual can also improve themselves.
And Tara, actually in your presentation, I love the idea of adaptive reuse, and I've sort of talked about it a lot in my research, though through some different lenses. That idea of adaptive reuse as it pertains to Canada and to sort of housing renovation is a really simple example, becomes quite complex economically because of sort of our bylaws and our building codes. The notion of renovating or reusing old things becomes substantially more expensive in most cases than building new things, which seems counterintuitive, but is kind of the fact and the reality of how it is. And so, despite maybe the best intentions and the best kind of, outcomes in many cases realistically, but despite the best intentions, I think our building codes and bylaws are inherently antagonistic in many ways towards models of not just adaptive reuse, but of more sustainable and more kind of economically approachable reuse of urban space into, affordable housing, into affordable community areas that someone can develop without, significant prohibitive cost investments and things like that. So it is kind of an ongoing thing, I think, in regard to policy as well in Canada in particular.
You think that in Canada, or do you mean specifically to like Alberta and Calgary?
I think across Canada, it definitely is an ongoing discussion. Like I know our building code in particular, and I'm gonna not sort of, poo-poo our building code necessarily because it has lots of benefits, but in Canada, our building code is comparatively very strict compared to the rest of the world, and it does inherently sort of make most of these proposals that you talk about, and even things that I love doing like renovation and reuse of space, very cost prohibitive in many cases. So I think it is specific to Alberta in some ways, but is more kind of specific to Canada overall, because we do have a national building code that is the overarching document over everything that sets those out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know in Ontario we work with the Ontario Building Code, and it's extremely
district as well. We do have a compliance alternative section that we work with quite a bit in my firm because we do primarily work on adaptive reuse and heritage projects. So I can sympathize with a lot of the things that you're saying. I think that what we're finding now is maybe this is particularly more so in London, but we're running out of new space to build. It's the space being all purchased and is being developed, and the sprawl is it needs to come to an end, and it needs to be maintained and controlled, and essentially the focus is returning to the downtown, into the core, and to revitalizing these projects. So I know that there's a lot of municipal incentives and things like that that are starting to come out to really help with that revitalization and reuse of a lot of these buildings that are sitting, because they're starting to see in, at least locally, that we're running out of this space and we can only do so much before we're going to have to start using the existing building stock in a creative way. And I think that there is a real dilemma because we have a lot of people already living in the downtown that cannot afford to move out and be gentrified by, these changes. So we're looking at new build, we're looking at existing building, and then we're looking at the expansion and sort of this sprawl, and sort of how can we mitigate all of those to provide spaces that are safe and enjoyable, but also don't come at an extreme high cost.
Definitely.
Okay, great, guys. And then our last question. The fundamental part of the urban center plate in capitalism is only intensified under neoliberalism and globalization, seen in the hyper-commodification of land, housing, transportation, public space, and utilities. Socio-spatial inequalities reveal how spaces have been constructed for capital over the needs of people. And these issues have been discussed by all three of you. Reflecting on the seminal writings of Henri Lefebvre and David Harvey, on the right to the city, we ask how much democratic control of the city be reasserted and urban territories be reclaimed for those marginalized by the system. The right to the city is a call for resistance and social justice. As Harvey says, if our urban world has been reimagined and made, that it can be reimagined and remade. So Hayden, Rey, and Tara, in your own words, what is the right to the city? How do you see architects, designers, urban planners, geographers, etc. play a role in moving forward towards more equitable cities? What sorts of urban imaginaries, reworkings, and remakings in the terms of our relationship with our professions, people around us, and environments are possible?
I guess maybe I'll open that up with just the comment that I think throughout this idea of urbanism that's really sort of not that old for the entirety of humanity, but in the idea of urbanism and development, I've stressed this in lots of my research that I think we really need to redefine our time scale and also our metrics of value and how we're defining value from inhabitants of the city or development in the city and things like that. So just in sort of thinking about the presentations and maybe in some of Tara's examples, that there is a significant cost to investment to embark on many of these projects that do lots of social good, but it's a much harder thing to promote and to embark on when cities only recognize value at the scale of, someone that's paying taxes every year or someone that's making a contribution or, people that are getting jobs right now. Whereas I think, being maybe advocates in policy change, or at least in conceptual change of cities and how policies manage to say that, projects like this are providing not only social benefit over very long periods of time, but inherent economic benefit over long periods of time by employing people, by building communities, by allowing for more economic mobility between classes. I think sort of we have to be sort of the leaders in helping to establish new metrics and scales of value to prove and to show the benefit that many of these projects can bring beyond an immediate financial benefit. to make them more feasible and to make them more kind of proportionately valued and recognizable by cities and by governments.
Okay. To me, the right to the city is a democratic control over the city, and it's a right to access, occupy, and use urban resources. We have to understand money is only one of many ways of resources allocation. We have to embrace more different domains in making and remaking our city. In the process, I think architects and designers, urban planners, and geographers play a role and carry out their value. As I say, changing the way of thinking is crucial to the success. I don't think the current model can be changed once for all by anyone. It is only feasible by collective work for a long time, just like cutting a salami, one slice by one slice. To do the best in our profession and practice our value in the process is the way of changing. This time, your board spends your idea of embracing local lead in the design. Next time, your idea maybe get adopted. Just try advocating, keep fighting, and struggling. Just like other people, all we need to do is to try our best to change people around us in our own position. Just try your best, yeah. Even though I believe there's no universal urban imaginary that fits every city, democracy, equitability, and participation are key elements to urban imagination, I believe. We have to understand our own city, find out the problems, and resolve the problems. In the long run, we will develop our own urban imaginaries through continuous interactions and discussion. It is a collective and everlasting process instead of a static picture existing out there and that to be found or told. I think comparison to other cities is helpful to our reflection and our urban imaginary. For example, there's an urban renewal project in working class community of Murray House in North Edinburgh. The developer and government collaborate with local stakeholders in the process, and developed 350 affordable housing out of 700 homes, and new employment opportunities developed together. Even though the practice and experience may not be applied to our city Calgary directly, it tells us substantial affordable housing is feasible in urban redevelopment project. When we dig in, we may find useful reference and insight that help us in the following projects. I think that would help us move forward towards more equitable city. Yeah, just try to do your best and compare to other cities and learn from others' experience. I think these are important to all, yeah, of our city.
Thanks, Ray, for that. I think that both the points that Hayden and Ray make are really important and viable and very valuable. I think that it's sometimes challenging working as an architect to feel that you're wearing many hats, where you're trying to
meet the needs of the client, meet the needs of the user, design for stakeholders, but you're also trying to rally the troops and make a really big impact on the community. And you get so overwhelmed with all of these things that it's hard to stop and think about, you know, what is the most important thing that I'm doing and why am I doing this? And I think with thinking about the future of cities, you know, there's a couple of things that we can think about. I mean, good design is good design. It doesn't matter who you're designing for. And I think if we can consider ourselves as designers and architects and urban planners, looking at a situation or looking at a problem and trying to come up with a solution, coming up with the best solution possible in the most economically viable way is always best for the user, and not considering whether or not this area has been gentrified or you know, this is an infill project, like looking at it strictly from a design and architectural point of view. I think that ultimately, as designers and architects, when we're working on projects, the details matter. I think that people who, especially people who are living in areas where perhaps they don't feel supported by their community, or the buildings around them are not particularly contributing to a positive way of living, they don't feel safe. I think when you start to introduce architecture that is well detailed and considers the way that it is introduced, that people recognize that. They realize that they matter, that the building that is being designed, or the infill project, or the art project, or whatever it is having a positive influence on their environment. And I think that when you get down to the actual details of these connections and how they're made, when you see sloppy work, or you see something that really hasn't been resolved, I think that is kind of a reflection of an overall project. But having these good details and really considering this, I know when I was doing my thesis project and I was making my defense, the person who was visiting, the critic, I apologize, I can't remember his name, but he brought this point up to me, and he said, you know, the reason that a lot of places fail is because the details aren't there. And I think that as an architect, outside of rallying and really trying to be an advocate for change, in our ability to design well, making these details matter can actually have a real impact. So I think looking in that sense, that's one way of considering how to reclaim the city as designers. I think that we are very lucky in our position. We have a huge responsibility. We can help shape the way that people experience the environment. And I think that, you know, we have to be aware of context and history of a place and really try to implement things that are considerate of that, and to really consider context rather than just throwing something in. Our firm is working on a couple of projects right now for affordable housing and a youth opportunity center. And we're really trying to talk to the users and understand what they want, and to really consider those details, and to think about the context and make those buildings and those programs work for them and of the place. And I think that makes a difference. So,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No.
Oh, I was going to say, as sort of my optimistic closing statement based off what you guys said, and because I assume most of the audience here are aspiring architects and designers, or architects and designers, I think as designers in this position, we're sort of acutely conditioned to arguing for things that many people see as intangible, whether that's sort of social benefit of projects and spaces, cultural benefit, and things that Rey touched on, which is modes of capital that aren't purely monetarily based, but social capital, cultural capital, things like that. And I think, yeah, as designers, we're very familiar with arguing for things like that many people don't see as having direct and tangible value, but that things that inherently do, whether it's right now or over the long term. So I think, you know, to everybody watching and everybody part of this panel, you're in a good position to be part of that discussion and to be able to contribute to that and contribute to convincing change makers and being change makers in the world, really, to that end.
Thank you, Hayden. That was a very inspirational end, not as inspirational about what I'm about to say, but that's okay. So we would like to close the panel off and give a big thank you to our lovely panelists for the important perspectives and knowledge shared, as well as the people who attended and supported field theories in AEDE. We'd also like to say thank you to the University of Calgary and the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape for their ongoing support of AEDE and the themes around equity that we have been discussing. So we have some exciting events coming up. This Saturday, our Field Notes Book Club is meeting to discuss Whose City with a focus on spaces for migration. Please visit our website for information and to register for the discussion. As well, next week, several AEDE representatives will be joining a roundtable hosted by the Treaty Lands and Global Stories organization from the University of Waterloo School of Architecture to discuss cross-institutional student movements for equity in design education. And more details will be made available on that. So once again, feel free to stay and chat for a bit and ask some questions. Otherwise, this is being recorded, so if you're unable to stay, you can catch the discussion and the rest of the panel on our website. Thank you and have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you next month. So I think
thank you.
Vincent had some questions in the chat. Vincent, if you want to go ahead, you can ask those.
Yeah, I'm very happy that the three panels are from Hayden. I've seen you before. And good that you're in Calgary.
Yes.
And Rey from Hong Kong, which I'm from Malaysia, by the way. Okay. So I just wanted to ask you questions on number one, especially in terms of cities. I mean, Hong Kong has always been a capitalist kind of situation. Who has money will, even the government, is very different from a government that I think even in Canada. So what I want, my first question is this: if from your research, all the observations are quite negative, actually. It's more tailored towards developer and real estate and making profit. And the government don't want to spend any money. And Hayden, in Calgary, it's the same thing. When it comes to affordable housing, the city of Calgary is not trying to spend any single cent. But what they're trying to do is to do PPP, partnerships. Now even they go to non-profit. And recently they want to give land bank to the non-profit because, they think they can handle affordable housing better. My first question is this: what's the way forward if we are sucking into this capitalist system where government don't want to use any money and they try to use developers to do affordable housing? Number one, which is, except for, because I've been in Singapore, and if you look at the Singapore Housing Development Board, they manage their affordable housing quite okay. Compared to many cities, many cities are not doing affordable housing well. Even in European countries where Calgary tried to model under gentrification, I mean, then you get this NIMBYism and so I just want to see your opinion on affordable housing and profit. Is there a correlation?
I think there definitely is, and what the point I would probably make that I think I sort of touched on earlier, which is maybe problematic of those partnerships and of the city's general approach to affordable housing, is that as soon as we are proposing housing for kind of underprivileged people, or these communities that need government help, the conversation and the general design approach becomes much more almost like saviorist, I would say, in a sense, where it's kind of these partnerships and these organizations deciding what these communities need and how to provide it for them and how to address these problems and speaking on their behalf, but because of their perceived sort of lower value to society, as I mentioned, from their contribution tax wise or anything else, these really shallow metrics, the power dynamic is really sort of taken away from them, and they're not given too much of a say and too much of a meaningful place in those discussions. So, I mean, versus maybe me coming and saying, you know, what we should do for these people and how these models should change. I think it's really important, as I've harped on a lot today, to recognize the inherent value these people bring to cities in many sort of senses of capital, and to actually give them a place at the table to ask them, you know, what models of housing do you want, and what models of housing will sort of work for you and will allow you to live a dignified life and to contribute and to have a meaningful place in society. I mean, it's not, I think it's only really my place to propose that we more meaningfully involve them in these discussions, not necessarily to say, you know, what we should or shouldn't do on their behalf. So it's sort of maybe a roundabout way of answering some of the problems you had, but I think that's sort of symptomatic all around the world, that the people with immediate money and capital are inherently making decisions for and on behalf of those people, and it's not always beneficial. You know, you look at brutalism in the last century, that experiment, like Pruitt-Igoe, things like that, very, very kind of symptomatic of decision-making on behalf of those communities rather than by and really involving those communities.
Okay, thanks for your question. And as I have said, urban redevelopment model should be more contextual. And what you're talking about, Hong Kong's urban renewal model and the financial feasibility of providing affordable housing is quite, to me, it's quite questionable, as Hong Kong's case is quite different from Singapore or in Canada especially. It is not a problem of financial competence to Hong Kong government, as there's no deficit budget in Hong Kong, and the government has 250 billion US dollar revenues. And what they are going to spend or do the urban renewal project is about 10 billion Hong Kong dollars in 10 years. And obviously they have the money to do a better and more social sustainable urban renewal projects, but it's all about their mentality and the political system. Singapore is a democratic country in any way, right? The government would be responsible and accountable to the public and most people, but in Hong Kong it's not. The government is not really elected by the public, and obviously the accountability is not as much as Canada and Singapore. They are more collaborate with the capitalists, developers, and other vested interests, and also the China, you know, they have to consider some political issues. That's why they can't really do it in a more sustainable way, provide more affordable housing to the inner city areas. And if you talk about the feasibility, we have another evidence that there's a lot of public rental housing in Hong Kong that's not profitable, right? They build public rental housing for about 40% Hong Kong people in general, and they are losing money. But those public rental housing in less desirable area, remote area that has no existence in inner city area. I think Singapore's experiences are really valuable to Hong Kong as I think those two cities at similar context, but not in a political and social way. But their economic situation is quite similar, and yeah, that's what I would respond to your question. Yeah.
Okay. But to just further to Hayden, you talk about community engagement, and I think a lot of times my experience in Canada is that this community engagement is just a checklist. You go and call all the affordable house. Let's say you call a sector of the affordable housing and what they want. Okay, I've done this, and then you still bulldoze through gentrification. Why I'm saying this is because I was driving, I think 2 days ago, from Calgary to Drumheller. There's so many open space and empty space. Okay, just hear me out first. Huh? I think Canada is not like Singapore or Hong Kong where space are limited, or Dubai space is limited. There's new areas like Seychelles, Settletown. I think if you look at the houses that is built towards the north, there's space that you can utilize. But I think I go back to what Tara has done in her projects. It's about making townships community feel and security. I think we do have the space. We can do good new affordable housing instead of gentrification. And sometimes I think people like to use community engagement, but sometimes this is about pressing needs. We have a high affordable housing shortage. We can't go through all this red tape, go council and all this. This is my two take on it. But I think it's important. Urban planners, you guys make solid policies. Government are there because we elected them to do the right thing. And it's two ways. I also don't deny there must be two ways, but I think everything must be done with community in mind, not with profit. Because without I don't like to use the word, but without lower end of the workers running your McDonald's and Subway, if everybody was a skilled worker, who would do the dirty job? So I think it's about recognizing humanity in the city, and if like Canada, there's so many space, we should think of those, making use of those abandoned ghost town. A lot of ghost town, which Professor Chris Fox likes to say, ghost towns. So I think we need to think of
Chris would say that.
Yeah, that's what he sent us to go and do. But what I'm trying to drive at is this. I think you said the right thing. Architects cannot play into the system. Architects need to be activists. Architects need to make that change, because urban planners, architects, and landscape architects have a lot to do with how this is how I feel.
I love the point you made about putting communities first in this sense, because I think I can speak to this through some examples, but I think the strongest sort of belief I have and our practice has is that we want to work for people that want to build these projects and invest in their community and their home because they're personally invested in it from not only an economic standpoint, obviously, but sort of a social standpoint and a community standpoint. And the first case study we looked at today with the bowling laneway is a really strong example of that, of somebody who was personally invested in their community and in increasing connectivity and sort of social cohesion in that community and heterogeneity, rather than, both her neighbors were real estate developers who bought tracts of land and essentially built the most that they could on those so that they could live in it a few years and then sell it for money. So we, in all these cases, whether it's public-private partnerships, affordable housing, things like that, it's really important to me that the people who are leading these things and who are involved in them and who are designing them inherently with architects are people that have real stakes in those communities and real interest in them beyond making money off a project and leaving. This is kind of an off-topic example for this panel, but there was a lot of discussion around the Portland riots recently about how, the police crackdown was so brutal kind of on inner city protests and everything. And there was a really good argument to be made about how much of the police force was comprised of officers who lived kind of outside of the city and not in the inner city and in suburbs. And that's really, I think, an exemplar of how important it is that people that are making decisions and who have power in those situations are actually invested in those communities and meaningfully involved, rather than just doing it for kind of a paycheck or for, you know, whatever temporary involvement that they may have. I think that's, you know, you make good points that leads to that conclusion being sort of an overarching factor in all these considerations of housing.
Great, thank you. I guess in the interest of time, if everyone is done, or if there are no more comments to be made, we can wrap up. Thank you again to our panelists. This was really great. And have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. This is great. I really appreciate you taking the time to put this together. Thank you for including me.
You as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for all of your time. We really appreciate it.